Okay, so if anyone's been following kind of recent developments in machine learning and AI, you might have noticed this term deep learning that's been flying around a little bit lately. So probably in the last, predominantly in the last 5 years, but maybe a few years longer as well. And that's really become the probably hottest topic and fastest growing topic in science ever. I've seen the biggest explosion in the number of researchers over the last decade. So the area that I've been working in was a very nice niche little place to work until suddenly noticed that the big machine learning conferences last year that there were more people working in this area than deep learning. So yeah, that's made research a little bit fun, but I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. So what this is all about, what the things I really care about, and I think everyone should care about too, is about automating decision making. Now this is something that statistics has cared about for a long time. It's something that's been probably one of the biggest questions that people ask in machine learning in general, is we want to make a decision of some sort. And this comes down to this idea of there's data and I want to possibly split the data into different categories. So there's, at a technical level, this is called the classification problem. Right? I want to be able to classify each instance of my data as belonging to one of several different classes. Now the nice thing is there's been a lot of work on this for a very long time. There's a whole family of different techniques you can use, from decision trees, logistic regression, random forests, nearest neighbors, support vector machines, graphical models, neural networks, you name it. Right? There's a whole zoo of these things that can help you do supervised learning, and particularly classification. Ben very kindly touched on this in some settings, trying to recognize things like signatures and so on, and this is really the kind of problem that we might be looking at. Now, hopefully this is a domain that's fairly familiar, and probably familiar to most people in different kinds of sciences as well. But this doesn't really get at everything we might care about. Right, so what about this? What about a situation where, just for argument's sake, you've got a robot in some sort of warehouse or factory, and you want to take long sequences of actions to be able to achieve some sort of behavior. I'm going to wait for the camera to stop. It's quite distracting. Thank you. All right. Now, the problem is that if you're trying to act in these sorts of situations, there's a lot else that comes into this, right? You've got to care about the causal dependencies between things you do, how it affects the world, and how this is going to affect what you do at a later point. But also, you might have very sparse feedback. So in the standard classification example, if I'm trying to classify out my white sheep from my black sheep, the standard data-driven, machine learning-based methodology for doing this involves getting a whole lot of training examples that belong to each of the categories and using that to train your model. Now, that's not the case when you're looking at these long, complicated behaviors, right? Because if I wanted to do that, what I should actually have is get my little robot guy and put him in every different scenario, and for every possible thing he should do, or he could try and do, I'd want some examples of good behavior and bad behavior. I feel like someone on the system hasn't muted their mic. Yes. Hello, someone hasn't muted their mic. Alright. So that's exciting. Alright. So I don't know what's going on, but I'll just carry on talking. Okay, so you'd want to know for every different option you could have available to you at any point in time, like what do good examples of behavior look like and what do bad examples of behavior look like, and you'd want to use this to build a model of good behavior in each situation. But again, if you look at this robot in this, there we go. If we look at this robot in this scenario, right, we might not know for every single possible movement it could make and every action it could take if that's a good or a bad action, right? What we want is that it carries on operating for some period of time and optimizes some objective we care about, right? We might not even know, as the people running the system, if each action along the way is good or bad. So this puts us squarely in a different form of machine learning to the standard supervised learning case. And in particular, conveniently, given that I'm talking about it, this is reinforcement learning. Right, so reinforcement learning is this branch of machine learning that's committed to figuring out how to make optimal decisions in these sequential decision-making processes. Right, so you've got this situation where you have to make a sequence of these decisions to achieve some sort of objective. And another way of looking at this, particularly with a background in robotics, might be to think about we're learning behaviors. So behavior is really a sequence of decisions where you care about the long-term effects, and maybe there's some sort of locality to it. There's some temporal structure that makes sense to this behavior. Now, if anyone's got an appropriate background, what I'm actually talking about here is stochastic optimal control theory with not just uncertainty, but unknown models. Right, so for people that work in that domain, what we're trying to do here is control theory, but we don't know our system dynamics and we don't know our objective function. And this is what this field is all about. Okay, so what we're going to be looking at, the kinds of problems we care about in this setting, is we've got our little decision maker, who might be a robot, might be a general software agent, and this exists inside some sort of environment. And what's going to happen is this continuous cycle of interaction, where your agent takes some actions based on the state of the environment. So if it was in this manufacturing setting, it might be based on the current state of construction of the object it's trying to build. But it might also take into account its current position in the world, current joint configurations, any state of information that this has. It's going to use that and take an action. And as a result of that, the environment state is going to update. And again, this might mean if I've taken a step to one direction, my own personal state of where I am physically situated has changed. But I might have made any decision here. I might have coupled one thing to another. I might have made a certain utterance in a conversation and so on. So the state of the environment, the state of the world has changed. And in addition, I might receive some sort of feedback in the form of what we call rewards. Right? And this notion of rewards ties to utility in more of a conventional control theoretic sense. Right? And then, as I mentioned earlier, these rewards are going to be typically sparse and delayed. So you're not going to be rewarded for every single thing you do. You might be rewarded for successfully completing assembling a car or something like that. Now, this is the general paradigm. So we're studying these problems of interaction, which is quite different to other problems in machine learning, where you might have some sort of data set and just want to extract some insights from this. Here it's this interactive process. So how do we go about modeling these processes? Well, the standard framework that we typically use in the setting is called the markup decision process. And just very briefly, what we look at is these are entities that give us some way of modeling this interaction, and that consists of a for tuple of two things. So firstly, you've got a number of states that the world could be in. So these could correspond to different states of assembly of the car we're building. This could correspond to a different state of health of a patient. It could be the physical configuration of a robot, and any other thing. And from each state, we've got a number of actions that we can choose between. Right? This is an interactive setting. What we're trying to do is we're trying to choose actions that are best under some description. And the point is that these are choices that our decision maker gets to make. Now what happens is once you've chosen an action, the world evolves somehow. Right? So the state is going to change depending on what state it was in when I started off and the action I took. Right? Which might be as simple as, this is my current position, I took a step forward, the state of the world, which is the state of myself, if that's what I care about, is now being updated. And these could well be stochastic in general. And finally, there's this notion of reward, that some of these transitions might be desirable and others not. In general, we assume most of them, there's no desirability associated with them at all. Most actions are going to come down to being things that ultimately take you to a better place in the state space, but we can't explicitly say how valuable they are in and of themselves. So the problem we'd be looking at here is, given some sort of a structure like this markup decision process, and given some initial state, can we choose a sequence of actions that maximize our long-term gain in this problem that we care about? And that's really how we formulate these problems. Now, the solution to a problem like this, instead of being something like a classification rule, is going to be what we call a policy or a behavior. So a policy, which we usually denote with the character pi, is any mapping from states to actions that tells us what we should do. Right? So the outcome of this learning process will be this behavior that says, if I'm in state 23 of the environment, the best action I can take is 76, right? Something like that. And this is really going to describe how we would want to evolve through the space, right? There's an evolution process that's happening through those transition dynamics, right? Which could also be modeled with things like differential equations to describe how the world evolves under certain changes I've made. But this is really about what do I choose in each situation. And the thing we ultimately care about is learning an optimal policy, right? So this is going to be the policy that accumulates maximal rewards when you run it, right? And this is what the core of the field is about. Given some problem that I can formulate this interactive decision process, can I learn a behavior that maximizes my utility or my reward in that interaction? So let's look at a little example, right? Imagine I've got this toy setting where I've got a little robot vacuum cleaner sitting in state S and can move around this little room, which is 4 by 3. And so the actions that it can take would be that it can move in any direction, any of the cardinal directions. And just going to describe the state as the location of this robot. Now, there's one state in position 4-3. That's like the dirt it has to look for, and it might get a positive reward when it collects that. And there's another state, 4-2, which might represent a hole in the floor, and when your robot falls into that, it gets stuck. Right? So this is how you might set up a problem like this, where you specify the action space, you specify the state space, you've got some idea of the dynamics of how this works. We have an intuitive understanding of how, if I move the robot to the right, where it would end up. And we've got this reward function, which is what we might want to achieve. In addition, we might even want to say things like, I'll give you a tiny little negative reward or a tiny little penalty for every action you take. And that's in a hope to try and get it to learn a behavior that's optimal also in terms of achieving this as quickly as possible. Now, if what it's trying to do is maximize total reward, for a simple toy example like this, you should all be able to figure out just by looking at it what the optimal behavior would look like, which would be something like this, right? So if the arrow in each cell indicates the optimal direction to move in, that's what you might expect to see as the policy, right? So what we care about is, for these kind of problems, can we learn this policy from interaction with the environment to be able to maximize rewards? Now, to do so, we need to have some way of evaluating these behaviors, right? If we want to learn, right, we're in the regime of machine learning, we'd like to be able to say, we've got some mechanism for choosing which are better behaviors, right? So as your policy is learning, it's giving you different trajectories as you move around the space. And the underlying assumption here is that I want my learning agent to keep interacting with this environment over time and producing stronger and stronger results and better policies. Right, so what we want to be able to do is have some notion of what are the best behaviors as this thing is learning. So simply, because we've got this notion of reward, what we can do is use the total discounted rewards. Well, don't worry about the discounting. We can look at how the rewards accumulate as it moves around this environment and use that to evaluate goodness. So you can imagine you've got all these different trajectories that are generated by different behaviors as we're learning, and we can measure their goodness by how much reward they accumulate. How often do they fall into that hole versus collect the dirt? Now, what should be clear in this discussion is that rewards are really critical, right? So the rewards or the utility really describes what kind of behavior we want to see emerging out of our learning agent, right? So the rewards at their core, we can think of as just some sort of a scalar feedback signal. And this is analogous, and there's been a lot of nice neuroscientific studies. It's very analogous to the way dopamine is released in the brain, as a way of us learning as humans to reinforce the good behaviors, right? When you do something and you get rewarded by, I don't know, you get something tasty to eat at the end or a positive interaction with someone, your brain releases dopamine, and that strengthens the connections that caused that outcome to happen. So the sequence of actions you took that led to that outcome are going to get reinforced. Right, so what we need is we need our rewards to encode different outcomes and our value over these outcomes. So we might want to encode things like winning or losing, colliding with walls, using a lot of energy to achieve the outcomes that we want. And it's got this very intuitive notion as tying into reinforcement learning the way we understand from psychology, right? The whole carrot versus stick idea. So if I give my agent a positive reward for achieving something, if it's trying to maximize total reward, that's the thing it's going to want to get more often. And vice versa with negative rewards. That's the thing it's going to want to avoid. But as I've mentioned already, typically these things are going to be sparse. We're going to get very few signals. So a lot of our interactions, as I'm moving around the environment, no dopamine is being released for just taking a step. I get my reward for having achieved a long sequence of actions that resulted in me getting cake, right? So now, getting cake in this sense is a delayed reward, right? It comes as the effect of having been planning out some course of action over the last 10 minutes, perhaps, right? So the challenge is I've got to be able to figure out what did I do well along the last 10 minutes or half an hour or 2 hours that led to me receiving this cake or this positive reward. And what's also important is that these rewards have relative value. Now, this idea of reward, of goodness or badness of outcome, should be familiar to most people, but particularly for anyone who's ever worked in industry, as alluded to in the previous talk, it's a difficult thing to set up incentive structures to get even people to do what you want them to do. And people are not known to be fantastic optimizers, right? So anyone who's ever been in a corporate environment and had to work with like KPIs or something will know that it's a huge headache to give some sort of incentive structure to the people working below you that actually achieves what you want them to achieve without them finding all sorts of loopholes you never considered before, right? So this is a problem with this way of thinking. And it's going to be even worse when you've got something that's actually a good optimizer trying to optimize these things. And one of the stories I love to tell is about the rats of Hanoi. So back in Hanoi in the early 1900s, when it was under French colonial rule, there was this problem where the city was overrun with rats. But to such an extent that the authorities didn't have the resources to deal with this. So they thought, okay, maybe what we can do is basically, I mean, they didn't use the word, but crowdsource the problem. So they decided, okay, the right way to do this is we're going to go and give some amount of money to any citizen who brings in a dead rat. And then they thought, okay, but that's pretty silly. We don't want piles of rat carcasses piling up in our government offices, so we'll just ask them to bring in the tails. Okay, so what happened is this started working really well. People started bringing in lots of tails from the rats that they killed. Until someone noticed that there were suddenly a lot of rats running around town that had no tails. And even worse, people started farming and breeding rats just to cut off their tails because it was a viable source of income. Now, as I said, humans are not known to be good optimizers, right? But machines are a lot better on this front. So this is a potential problem. If we're building systems that are trying to optimize some reward structure that we give them, this is something we have to be careful about. But I'll leave that terrifying thought to learn for a second and go back to the technical stuff. Okay, so having defined some sort of a reward structure, you can't just make your decisions greedily at every point, right? So if there's a possibility of getting a small reward like at the next point in time versus getting no reward at the next point in time, the greedy solution would just be go with the thing that gives you some reward. But actually, the long-term decision might be to not act greedily, because that might be taking you further away from something that gives you a better payoff in the long run. And these are the kinds of delayed effects that we've got to take into account when we're doing this kind of reasoning and learning. Now, because your rewards don't encode this information about, hey, in this case, going to the right one step actually takes me closer to a bigger payoff, we've got to have some sort of structure in our algorithms and our methods that that we can leverage to start reasoning about these things. And this is what in reinforcement learning we call value. Right? So value gives you this kind of implicit goodness of a state or a place to be in the world as on the path towards getting the ultimate rewards that you'd like to receive. And technically we refer to the structure that encodes this as a value function. The way you might want to think about this is we need this notion that says, how good is it to be in a certain configuration in the world, given that after that I'm going to be doing a whole lot of other stuff. Okay, so as I said, each configuration of the world doesn't necessarily have value, or doesn't give you a reward, but it's got some value when you take a longer term behavior into account. So the way you might want to think about this is, as let's say we've got our little agent in the bottom corner there, who's just going to take a random meander around some world, where he's trying to reach the goal in the top corner, and at some point he reaches that, right? So this might have given the agent like a reward of 100 for argument's sake. So what we need some sort of structure that starts encoding that everything further and further away from that has some sort of slightly diminished value. Because if we have that for every possible state in the world, right, we can just do some sort of gradient descent up this value structure and figure out what the best action to take in each possible situation would be. So just as a kind of toy practical example, imagine you've got that same agent moving around this little environment with left, right, up, down actions, but there's 2 points, A and B, that if the agent reaches there, it magically teleports somewhere else and receives a payoff. So if it gets to A, it teleports to A prime and gets a reward of 10, and B, it goes to B prime and gets a reward of 5. So if you were just moving around this environment, right, you would have no information until you got to A or B, and then you get something good happening. Now again, if we want this to learn an optimal behavior of how to work in this environment, we needed to learn some notion of value, or how good is everywhere else in this space. So if I were to compute this, I'd get something that looks like that colored map over there, right? So that would be, instead of just those 2 points that give you some payoff, this gives you some implicit notion of how valuable is it to be at any point in this space, right? And again, if you were to do something like follow the gradient, you'd head more towards this brighter point on this map. That's the desirable point, and that would encode the goodness of each of these points. And from this, you can just directly read off your optimal policy, which just says move in the direction that takes you to a state with higher value. So that's really the kinds of information we'd like to be able to learn or infer about the rest of the environment that our little agent is working in, so that at any point in time it can make a decision that's optimal with respect to its long-term behaviors. Okay, so having spoken about rewards and values a little bit, I'd like to talk to you about how this actually works in practice. So if you remember back to what I described as the MDP, the Markov decision process, you've got your states of the world, so these are all the places my little agent might be in. You've got the actions he can take. You've got the transition dynamics, which says if I'm in one state and I move north, I end up in another state. And you've got this reward function. Now, we tend to be fairly brutal to our agents and not tell them what these two functions are. So we don't tell them the transition functions and we don't tell them the reward functions. And these are things they need to learn from experience. So instead of giving these to our agent, right, we might want them to move around and generate their own data, right? Again, harking back to that this is a kind of machine learning, but instead of a data set, we're letting it generate its own data. So what it might do is you've got your little agent that's somewhere in the world, and if it took a random action and ended up in a new state and got some sort of payoff, we want to be able to learn from these samples in a way that gives it some information about the environment that it can start exploiting over time to perform better. Right? So similarly, you might be in another part of the environment, take an action, and achieve a different payout. Right? In this case, maybe he couldn't move, he tried to go north, and the outcome was nothing happened, but I got a negative reward. Now to do this, there's a couple things you need. So firstly, we need a mechanism for choosing actions, and then we need some sort of model of keeping track of what he's doing. Now, choosing actions is an interesting problem that's got quite a long history in statistics. It's called the bandage problem or the multi-arm bandage problem. So the kind of analogy here is that you walk into a casino and there's a whole host of one-on-banded machines. And if you played each machine, it gives you payouts according to some distribution. And this problem in its pure setup is, how do I select over possibly infinite interactions, where my interaction is choose a machine to play? How do I choose the machines that give me the optimal payouts? Right? Because obviously if I choose machine 3 and it gives me some payout of 3 Rand, that might be the best thing it could do, but it might be the worst thing it could do. And so in the limit, you want to figure out what is the best way to spend my budget in interacting with these machines. The other example I like to think of here is, if you go into a restaurant, right, and it's the first time you've been there, and you order a pizza, and it's like amazing. This is just an unbelievable pizza. So good you go back to this restaurant. Now you sit down, you're looking at the menu. But what should you do? That might have been the worst item on the menu, right? It was still delicious, but maybe you should try something else. And this comes down to what's historically been called the exploration-exploitation problem, right? Sometimes you need to explore and try new options. And other times you want to exploit and take the best thing you've ever encountered so far. So we think about this in our action selection while our agent is learning, right? We've got to take this trade-off into account. And what you want to do, if you want to maximize your performance in this setting, is sometimes you want to exploit this knowledge that you've already gained from learning and interacting in this environment and take the best thing that you know how to do in that situation. And other times you want to try something new, because you might have missed a shortcut, or you might have missed something fantastic. So just to make it a little bit more concrete, one of the strategies that you could use is what we call epsilon greedy, which says every single time with some probability, like 1 minus epsilon, we're going to exploit. We're going to choose the best thing that we've seen in this situation before while we're learning. And with the remaining probability, we're going to choose a random action. And these kinds of ideas give us a way of trading off between these two outcomes. This is a very simple scheme, and there's a lot of work that's been done on different kinds of exploration schemes. But just to give you an idea of how you might try and trade these off. As your agent is trying new possibilities in the world, you wanted to think about these two extremes. And typically we get it to only start exploiting later on, right? It's got to have learned something for exploitation to make sense. Right, so as I said, if we've got this mechanism to choose actions while we're learning, we also need a way to store this information. And for that we're going to use these value function ideas that I mentioned earlier. So there's a lot of interesting algorithms, and I just want to give you kind of a flavor of the kinds of ways that these work in practice, with one of the most basic ones, which is called temporal difference learning. And the way you might have an agent trying to learn behaviors in the setting works as follows. So you want it to have many different interactions with the environment, and for each one, you're going to pick some sort of start state where your agent starts. This might be, if it's navigating, it starts at a certain position in the door. If it's trying to learn to manufacture something, it starts with the unassembled vehicle. And each state has some notion of value associated with it. And now we're going to run a lot of interactions with the environment, or a simulated environment, to learn the value of different decisions in the set. And typically the way this works is you're going to choose an action in each state according to some policy that comes out of the value that you've already got. And this would typically involve something like that epsilon greedy exploration I just mentioned. You're going to take that action, and the environment moves to a new state, and you may or may not get a payoff. And then you're going to update your estimate of the value of the state you started in based on what happened. So if something good happens, I should effectively be taking a weighted average towards the positive direction, and if something bad happened, towards the negative direction. If I got no feedback, then that doesn't update anything until later on when I've got a better idea of the value of the next state. So there's this inherent recursion in this way of learning. And then you move your agent to the next stage. So the important thing to notice here is this whole methodology is based around this idea that you want to keep learning while you're actually performing the task. So this is why it's become so popular in artificial intelligence lately, is because this really talks about how you improve your performance at something that you might keep being involved in or keep interacting. And the cool thing is that as this goes along, you tend to get these kinds of learning curves, apologies for the poor quality there, which starts off when your first few episodes, if you look at the x-axis is episodes, or think of that as number of attempts at this task. Right? You start off with no knowledge, and as you get better, right, or as you progress, you gain a better understanding, which means you've got a better, in the way I've described it here, encoding of the value of these states. And once you do that, you can obviously exploit in a better way, so you're optimizing better. So as you interact in this environment for longer, your performance is going to improve, up to some point where you converge at hopefully optimal behavior. Okay, so that's really cool. And this is how, in a at least fairly simple conceptual idea, you might have an agent trying to learn a behavior. But the problem is that the real world is continuous and messy and dirty and high-dimensional, and it's not just moving around a two-dimensional maze, but it's maybe a robot trying to make you pancakes. And this is obviously more complicated. So what we do is we bring in all the tools that we have from deep learning. Right? So we can go and do things like approximate these value functions or these policies or any of a number of other elements of the problem with deep neural networks. Right, so the nice thing is neural networks, being universal function approximators, can learn any function that we want. If they're sufficiently complex and with a number of caveats and also enough data, right, we can learn the correct representation for the problem we're trying to solve. So that's really cool and useful. But now we've gone and taken what was a hard problem already and compounded this with another really hard problem, which is learning neural networks. So this has always been a challenge in the field to make these two bits of technology, right? You've got a neural network, which is typically doing supervised learning here, occasionally unsupervised learning, and then your decision theoretic problem, which is the reinforcement learning problem, and you've got these two pieces that are playing together. So there was one really notable exception, which was in the early 90s. There was this algorithm called TD Gammon, which was created by Jerry Tesoro. And what was really cool is this was a mechanism to play backgammon. Right? So they used a very simple neural network. It was like one hidden layer in the thing, to learn a representation of the board. And again, the reward structure here was very simple. You would get a reward of 1 if you won the game, -1 if you lost, and 0 otherwise. And from learning from 1.5 million games of experience, this thing learned to play at the level of basically the best humans that we have, which was super cool. Right, so it played against itself over and over again for about 1.5 million games and achieved human level performance at this problem. And the other really cool thing that I like about this example is it changed the way human backgammon players play, because they could see new strategies coming out of this. So that was a really exciting early breakthrough. But then for a number of years, people struggled to do anything else in this combination of the deep learning and reinforcement learning space. Or it wasn't called deep learning back then, but anyway. So a few years back, suddenly there were all these breakthroughs that happened in deep learning and making them less about voodoo magic to get working. And in particular, there have been a couple of big companies and big labs that have really started taking this seriously. And one of the interesting developments that happened was in 2013, this arcade learning environment was released. So what this was like an emulator for old Atari video games. These like really pixelated old school video games. And there was 50-something games that you could emulate. And they wrote basically an API that let you plug this into an AI agent. Right? So you could have different kinds of algorithms that could actually interface with the with each game. And this was kind of set up as a new grand challenge in artificial intelligence. Can I get an artificial agent to learn to play some of these old video games? So it didn't take long before the answer was yes. So in some work that came out of DeepMind, they basically figured out a right way of connecting reinforcement learning and deep learning, which is now one of the classical algorithms in deep reinforcement learning called deep Q networks. And they found some very clever tricks to piece these things together in a way that let it learn to play this game. So what happened was your agent in this case, as input, takes the pixels of the screen from the game, which was also kind of mind-blowing for the time, like working on pixel level stuff, that's crazy people talk. What they did was they actually took 4 frames at a time, because that encodes some notion of velocity and acceleration of what's happening on the screen. and with no prior human knowledge of the gameplay, it had to learn how to play the game. Now, it turns out there were 18 different actions that would have to be learned at each point. So this is like your joystick actions and hitting buttons on these old video games. And the very cool thing that came out was, let's see if this plays. Right, so here's some play of their algorithm. So this is just on the game of Breakout. And the cool thing I want to point out here is that this learning agent has no prior knowledge of how this game works. Right, so it had no human knowledge coded into it. All that it had was these generic learning mechanisms, and it was plugged into a simulator, so it could try things. So hopefully you're all familiar with this game, or at least you should be able to see after a few seconds what the point is, to try and bounce this ball to delete all those blocks. But at the beginning of training, it's just acting randomly. Right? So it's got 18 actions to choose from, and it just chooses these things randomly. So it's pretty useless, and doesn't do much that's cool. But after 120 minutes, obviously that's on Google's compute, so it's more like a lot more time in normal people land, it starts learning to play like an expert. Right? So at this point, it's learned enough of the value function that it effectively understands the physics of the domain well enough to play this game. And again, this was with no prior human knowledge. Then the super cool thing happened. If you leave this thing training for another couple hours, what this did was it learned a strategy which is kind of almost exploitative of how the reward structure was set up, but like a really cool thing that shows to some level some insights in how this problem domain works. Right? So it learned how to get this thing up the top, and that's how you optimize performance on this task. Now, what was also super impressive in this case is that it might be a bit too small to see, but the exact same algorithm with no changes to it whatsoever was able to play all these different games, and for the bulk of them, that's everything above that line in the middle, achieve play better than humans. Right? So there was no domain knowledge plugged into this thing, it was just plugged into a different simulator and given time to learn. So the principle is, if it's learning this notion, well, it's an equivalent thing to the value functions I spoke about earlier, right, where that value function encodes long-term goodness of any situation, right, that's how you learn to get human-level performance in these things. Okay, so that's really cool, story over. But actually, these are just simple games, right? So I just want to mention quickly something that's maybe a little bit more complicated. The game of Go, which is a game that's, I don't know, about 2.5, maybe more 1,000 years old from China, and it's often considered to be the game that chess players upgrade to when they get sick of playing chess. And it's actually a very simple game where you take turns playing a black stone or a white stone, and it's about capturing territory. Now the interesting thing about this is it's a huge game, right? So there's 361 moves you can make in general, right? You can play at any of the intersections of these 19 by 19 lines, and there's considerably more states of possible states of the board than atoms in the universe. I mean, it doesn't mean much to say this, everything's got more states than atoms in the universe, but this is a particularly complicated problem. But in addition, it's adversarial, which none of the Atari games were. So this has been considered for a long time to, again, be a grand challenge in AI that we expect only to be able to solve in the next, I don't know, 20, 25 years or so. But anyone who follows the field will know that that's the face of disappointment. So that's Lisa Doll, who was considered not just the best Go player, but the best Go player ever. And in a highly publicized match in the last, when was this, 2 years ago, something like that, he lost 4-1 to this algorithm. Now the interesting thing there is this was an algorithm that this was a far more sophisticated version of the one that I showed you with Atari, but people have been working on this for about 2 years. There was a number of months of training, and there was actually a lot of hand-coded knowledge in this, a lot of knowledge about how the game of Go actually works, right? To help it solve such a complicated problem. The interesting thing was, less than a year later, the same team released a successor to their algorithm that had beat the greatest player ever, which beat that previous one 100-0, and had zero knowledge of the game. So it didn't even get to see human games. All it did, so the previous one had spent a lot of time studying human games and so on. This one just had, if I remember correctly, 72 hours of self-play with no knowledge about the game of Go, and it's now the best Go player we've ever seen, human or machine. The interesting thing was there, it had so little knowledge of the game specifically that they then unplugged it from the Go simulator, plugged it into the chess simulator, and again, I might be wrong with the numbers, but 4 hours later was the best chess player we've ever built. Right? So this has zero domain knowledge about any problem. It's just doing very clever ways of learning through self-play. So you can look at these things and think these are very big, complicated problems. And then you might start wondering, what is the complexity of any real-world decision we want to make? If you want to run a company or a country or something like that, what kind of complexity or problem do you need to look at over there? So, not going into that in too much detail, because no one's automated governments yet. I think we're close, but this is Starcraft. So Starcraft is what's called a real-time strategy game. And this is possibly one of the most popular games ever made. Technically, this is Starcraft 2. And just over a year ago, this was set up as the grand challenge of AI. Right, so in this game, you've got typically multiple players playing at the same time. You've got to control, effectively what you do is you build a base. So to do that, you've got to build different kinds of agents that can mine resources. So you have to manage resources. You've got to build infrastructure. You've got to build different kinds of facilities. You've got to keep them running in different ways. There's certain resource constraints that you've got to effectively, if your population grows too big, you've got to build new farms and find safe areas to build them. And ultimately, you're building an army and attacking enemies and trying to wipe out their base. This is a highly complex game that happens in real time. If you watch the professional players, they're phenomenal. It's like you don't even see their fingers moving, and they're sending hundreds of troops all over the place, and it's really impressive to watch. I unfortunately don't have a video of this. But also what's interesting is this takes place on a huge map. So what you see here is what's visible to any player is like one part of the screen, but this might be a tiny segment. So you might be able to see in the bottom left corner, there's a little map, and there's a little kind of rectangle there showing what the screen's currently looking at. So it's a really big map, and usually you don't have access to what's happening in the rest of the map. You have to explore there first. So it's an incredibly complicated problem that's happening at the pixel level. It's adversarial. There's multiple opponents. And this is now the standard, most difficult domain we've ever given AIs to solve. So a few weeks ago we solved it. So this is now, there was a highly publicized thing a few weeks ago where they beat some of the best players in the world, and these are professional players. They get paid to play this game. Mostly Koreans, actually. And now, if you look at this, if you look at the complexity of the domains I've been talking about, you've got Atari, where you've got near perfect information, single player, 17 actions, or 17 or 18, depending how you look at it, and typically each game lasts for hundreds of moves. You've then got Go, which is supposedly the hardest board game ever made by people, which there you've got perfect information. It's a multiplayer game, 361 actions, and a game usually lasts for hundreds of actions as well. Starcraft, you've got imperfect information. It's multiplayer, so it's adversarial. You've got many millions of actions available to you because you can just generate new troops, move them in different places, and so on. And the games are considerably longer than all these other domains. So this is where we're sitting at state-of-the-art in automated decision-making, right? With the ability to manage resources, build infrastructure, admittedly in a very confined, controlled space where you can effectively learn the physics models of the entire domain, but it still takes billions of instances of this because we're learning it not just from like event space, but we're learning this from pixels, right? It learns to beat humans by just looking at correlations between pixels, right? Which is somewhat mind-blowing. So this is what we do with games, because we're AI researchers and we like taking life seriously. But we also take life seriously in other ways. We play with robots. So I just want to give, no, there's no audio, that's a lie. I don't know if I can jump ahead here. Can I? I don't know. No, I can't. So we're going to have to sit through the beginning bit, and there must be a better way to do this. Maybe. Is the right way? Okay, so this just gives you an example of how you can use the same kind of techniques in real world tasks. So these are robots that are controlling complicated spaces. These are continuous spaces of their whole joint configurations. They're trying to solve, this is using the same algorithm to solve a whole lot of different tasks. Admittedly, it's a lot more constrained. It's harder to do experiments in a robotic space than a video game that you can leave running overnight. But this is real-time actions of a robot that's been trained to solve these different tasks using the same kind of infrastructure. So having played or tried each of these things numbers of times, it learns the dynamics and the objectives of each of these tasks to the level where it can perform these things in noisy environments as you perturb things and so on, right? So there's actually fairly big perturbations in this, right? Typically for a robot task, you'd be like strongly calibrated to each particular situation. You'd have to have things with precise measurements. The camera is very well calibrated and so on. This, all it does is it's learning from the camera of the robot and its arm position. Okay, so these are the same kinds of methods being used in the setting. Alright, now those are all fun and cool, but to our great disappointment, these techniques also have real world value, which, you know, anyone who's an actual researcher should realize this is not what you want. So I just want to give a few examples of the kinds of places where you can use these ideas. So I'm going to give just a few examples quickly that have come out of papers recently. This one not so recently, but so these ideas of reinforcement learning have been used for things like training traffic light schedules to be synchronized across cities or regions of cities. So it's the same kind of thing where you've got this effectively a control problem that you're trying to optimize the synchronization of these lights in a way that maximizes traffic flow and minimizes congestion and these kinds of things. Then obviously, because of the internet, one of the biggest application areas for this is advertising. Because here your behaviors might amount to what kind of adverts do I put and where should I put them in the screen? Right? You can run these as different tests. You can try your adverts at the top or the bottom or the left or the right. You can have different colors and different patterns and layouts and amount of text versus imagery and static versus dynamic. And so these techniques are also used very widely in the advertising space to optimize income or revenue generated from ad clicks, right? Which is a very nice formulation of the problem of trying to maximize income. Then something that strangely got a hell of a lot of publicity was Google used these techniques. So it was the same team that produced the Go playing algorithms, have used these techniques to optimize cooling of their data centers, which obviously has bills that run into the billions, or probably not billions, billions, I don't know. I don't run a data center. But if you've got all of Google's data, then your cooling schedules are huge expenses to you. So these techniques are currently running all of their cooling schedules in all their data centers. And then there's other interesting things, like for example, there's been work on trying to speed up and improve the performance of chemical reactions by changing things like the reagents, the temperatures, the conditions under which these are happening. And so these kinds of ideas are finding their way into chem labs and bio labs to improve experimental methodologies, which is really cool. The nice thing is, it's spoken about quite a lot in this literature, is that the ultimate point just by scaling this up is that you should be able to automate all your chemical or biological experiments completely, because everything else is just actions taken by people, and that's exactly what these methods are supposed to deal with. So these are just 4 examples that are happening already. I just want to briefly mention a few obvious spaces where things are already happening and like the investment into reinforcement learning is growing considerably. So an obvious one is manufacturing. Your standard manufacturing setup has that if you change your production line, your plant comes down for a couple months while all your robots get recalibrated and moved around and your conveyor belts are shifted and all this sort of thing. But now in a more kind of, I hate the term, but industry 4.0 kind of setting, you've got these systems that are able to learn and recalibrate. So you can do things like, you know, show to one of the cameras what the objects you're looking for look like, where they're coming from, and just learn behaviors. Or you can get people to do things like joystick control the robots and using a thing called inverse reinforcement learning infer the behaviors that should be learned. And there's been a lot of work in logistics of various sorts, right? Because all of these are things that you can typically set up as optimization and decision-making problems. So the whole area of logistics is undergoing fairly rapid upgrading, given techniques like reinforcement learning. I think that's a fairly trivial to see problem of why you might want to do that and how it would fit in a mapping sense. Finance is obviously seen a lot here, right? Here you're trying to buy and sell, you're trying to trade in shares or something, right? It's the same kind of problem as all these other things. You're trying to make long sequences of decisions that end up maximizing your profit. It's a perfect setup for this kind of problem. But in addition, you might want to start evaluating things like estimating the potential payouts of big projects. How should I distribute assets over my portfolio and so on. Again, this is perfectly set up as a reinforcement learning problem, and all that we need is large amounts of data or some way to simulate this and interact with it, and we can use all the same techniques I've been talking about before. One of the things I'm most excited about here that's really much more in a nascent stage is looking at these ideas in healthcare. Right? You could think about there's the standard supervised learning problem of someone had an X-ray, can I tell what's wrong with their chest or something from that? But the RL problem is more like the entire doctor's job, which is this person comes into the clinic repeatedly, I've got a number of decision points, I can run different tests, I don't know what the results will be, but I can have expectations over what they might look like, I can change their treatments, I can order new tests, I can get specialist advice, right? That's a decision problem that's underlying the whole process of medical diagnosis. So there's starting to be more and more work in this direction to say, can we piece together all the what were previously trivial machine learning problems of understanding diagnostic results of a single test into these much broader scale problems. Finally, another one I'm very excited about is the idea of education. Right, so even in my lab here, we're looking at problems where you can, based on the way a student is interacting with their course material, you can use ideas from reinforcement learning to change the curriculum that they're interacting with. Right, so you can ask questions like, what is the best presentation or ordering of my content that will maximize their knowledge retention of the subject or their ability to solve the most complicated problems or something like this. So what's really exciting is that anywhere where there's humans making decisions, there's the possibility for reinforcement learning to revolutionize that. I just want to end with my final thing, which is the understanding of how decision making happens in general. This is inspired by a lot of consulting work. So typically what you've got is you've got some sort of observation process that goes on, and you're understanding, you're collecting data and so on. You want to be able to make predictions based on this data. And finally, you want to make some interventions or make some decisions. And then typically, or the way the world generally works now, is the stuff at the top is automated, and the stuff at the bottom is human, right? So we, for no particular example, might be trying to collect data on if someone's going to be leaving our online service in the next 2 weeks, and we might have an unrealistically good model that can predict to an 87% accuracy if someone will be leaving in the next 2 weeks. And then we find this model doesn't work because a human had to make a decision which was like, oh, if this person's going to leave, I should give them coupons. And then you find the whole system breaks because humans are terribly suboptimal and our algorithms are very optimal. So where we're going with all this work is to cut the human out of the loop, and then everything runs nicely and smoothly. And this is what reinforcement learning does. So that's all I have to say. This is a very outdated picture. It's probably at this point, it's about a third to a quarter of my lab. And yeah, so these are all the stuff we're playing with, based mainly here at WITS, a little bit at the CSIR. We focus mainly on reinforcement learning and trying to scale these techniques up to deal with far more complicated problems, and also particularly deal with the big limitations, which are things like the fact that you need large amounts of data to learn this. A lot of our work is based on the idea of, can we accelerate that by just learning about a lot of different related tasks? So I think I'm just in time, and with that, thank you for your attention.